The day after my husband's death, I came home to find the locks changed, and his mother calmly unpacking in my kitchen. "You're just a wife without rights. This house belongs to family now," she sneered. I didn't argue. I stared then smiled because they'd forgotten something crucial. Patricia called while I was signing papers at the funeral home. "Mom thinks it would be easier if you didn't come back to the apartment right away," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "We're helping sort through John's things." The line went dead before I could respond. 2 hours later I discovered what they meant by helping. New locks on apartment 4B, my suitcase in the hallway, and through the window, Deborah sitting at my kitchen table, writing in what looked like my checkbook. The funeral director, Mr. Grayson, was still explaining burial plot maintenance fees when Patricia's call came through. I stepped into the hallway to answer, thinking she might need directions to the cemetery for tomorrow's service. Her words made no sense at first. Why would it be easier? John's things were our things, woven together through 7 years of marriage in that pre-war apartment on East 78th Street. The abrupt dial tone left me staring at my phone while grief-stricken families passed by in the funeral home's burgundy corridor. "Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here with me today. If you believe that widows deserve respect and protection during their darkest hours, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear these stories." I signed the remaining papers hastily, my signature getting sloppier with each form. The drive from the funeral home in Queens back to Manhattan took 40 minutes in traffic, 40 minutes of replaying Patricia's words. Something cold was spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with losing John. By the time I reached our building, parallel parking in the spot John had painted a small X on to mark as ours, my hands were trembling for reasons beyond exhaustion. The elevator in our building had always been slow, but that day it crawled. Second floor, third floor, each ding marking another second before I'd understand what Patricia meant. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, I saw it immediately. My suitcase, the red one John bought me for our 5th anniversary, sitting against the hallway wall like abandoned luggage at an airport. My laptop bag leaned beside it, and a cardboard box with Mary's items written in Patricia's neat handwriting sat on top. My key slid into the lock but wouldn't turn. I tried again, wiggling it the way you do when locks get sticky in winter. Nothing. The brass felt foreign under my fingers, newer than the worn keyhole I'd used thousands of times. That's when I looked through the window beside the door, the one John had installed so we could see visitors. Deborah sat at my kitchen table, her pearl necklace catching the afternoon light, calmly writing in what was definitely my checkbook. She was wearing the cashmere cardigan John had given her last Christmas. 7 years we'd lived in 4B. 7 years of Sunday morning French toast, of John humming Beatles songs off-key while scrambling eggs, of planning our future against those kitchen walls. We'd painted them sage green together our 2nd year, arguing about shades for 3 hours in Home Depot before compromising on restful rain. We'd made love on that kitchen floor once, drunk on wine and laughter after his company's holiday party. We'd fought there too, about money when his first startup failed, about children we kept postponing, about his mother's constant disapproval of me. The apartment had been our sanctuary from Deborah's judgment. She'd never approved of John marrying a technical writer instead of the surgeon or lawyer she'd envisioned. At our wedding, City Hall, just witnesses the way we wanted, she'd worn black and left before cake. For 7 years she'd made comments about my little freelance projects, and asked John when he was going to settle down properly, as if our marriage was just practice for his real life. But John had chosen me, defended me, loved me with a fierceness that made her criticism bearable. 3 months ago, when he'd finally gotten promoted to creative director, he'd said, "We'll renovate the bathroom with my first bonus. Real tiles, not that press-on garbage. We're going to die in this apartment, Mayor. When we're 90, we'll still be here and Mom will still be asking when I'm going to meet someone suitable." I knocked on the door. Deborah looked up from my checkbook but didn't move. I knocked harder, using my fist now. Patricia appeared behind her mother, said something I couldn't hear, then walked to the door. She opened it exactly 3 inches, the chain still secured. "This is illegal," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I live here. My name is on the lease." "Actually," Patricia said, not quite meeting my eyes, "only John's name was on the lease. Mom confirmed with the building management. Without a formal marriage certificate filed with them, you're technically just a long-term guest. We were married for 7 years. Mom thinks," Patricia started. I don't care what your mother thinks. My voice was rising now, and Mrs. Chin from 4C poked her head out. My husband died yesterday. Yesterday. His body isn't even in the ground, and you're stealing my home. No one's stealing, Deborah called from the kitchen, still not getting up. I'm protecting my son's assets. You can collect your things. Patricia packed them carefully. I looked at the box beside my feet. 7 years reduced to one cardboard container and a suitcase. Inside 4B, I could see Deborah had already started changing things. A new tablecloth on the dining table. Her hideous cat figurines on the bookshelf where my photography books had been. The kitchen window was open, and I could hear the radio playing classical music, the kind John hated but pretended to enjoy when his mother visited. Where am I supposed to go? I asked Patricia through the gap. She shifted uncomfortably. Mom says you must have family. Or friends. This was always John's apartment. You knew that. No, I thought. It was our apartment. Our names on the utility bills, our shared Netflix account logged into the smart TV, our intertwined lives in every corner. But Deborah had been planning this. She must have been waiting, preparing, maybe even hoping for this chance to reclaim her son from the woman she deemed unworthy. Mrs. Chin was still watching from her doorway. I caught her eye, and she shook her head slowly, sadly. 3 weeks ago she tried to warn me. She'd seen Deborah testing doorknobs, asking the super about lease transfers, studying the building's bylaws. Watch that one, she'd said over tea. Some mothers never let go. I picked up my suitcase, my laptop bag, the pathetic box of my things. Patricia was already closing the door. Through the narrowing gap, I saw Deborah tear a check from my checkbook, fold it carefully, and place it in her purse. She was smiling, the satisfied smile of someone who'd won a game the other person didn't know they were playing. The hotel near Penn Station cost $90 a night and smelled like cigarette smoke despite the no-smoking signs plastered everywhere. I sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the cardboard box Patricia had packed, when my phone buzzed with a text from my friend Angela. How's John doing? Any change? The question knocked the wind out of me. Angela didn't know John was dead. Most people didn't yet. I'd been too consumed with funeral arrangements to make calls. And now I was homeless with a husband to bury tomorrow. But sitting in that dingy room, I remembered something else. The hospital. Those final 2 days when everything had shifted. When Deborah had shown her true intentions while John lay dying. I should have seen it coming then. It had started 3 days ago when John collapsed in our kitchen. The ambulance ride to Mount Sinai had been a blur of sirens and medical terminology I didn't understand. They'd rushed him into the cardiac unit, leaving me in a waiting room that felt like purgatory, beige walls, uncomfortable chairs, and a television playing morning news on mute. For 6 hours I'd sat there alone, calling his office to say he wouldn't be in, texting Patricia that her brother was in the hospital, leaving a voicemail for Deborah that I knew she'd ignore until it suited her. When Deborah finally arrived that evening, she swept through the cardiac unit doors wearing her signature pearls and a black dress that looked more appropriate for a board meeting than a hospital visit. She didn't acknowledge me at first, walking straight to the nurse's station. I'm Deborah Whitmore, she announced, her voice carrying across the entire ward. John Whitmore's mother. I need to speak with his physician immediately. The nurse, a patient woman named Carol who'd been updating me all day, glanced at me before responding. Mrs. Whitmore's wife has been here since this morning. She's listed as his healthcare proxy. His wife. Deborah turned to look at me for the first time, her expression suggesting she discovered something distasteful on her shoe. I'm his mother. His actual family. I have rights here. Ma'am, the healthcare proxy designation, Carol began. I want to see that document, Deborah interrupted. My son wasn't in his right mind when he signed whatever papers she pushed in front of him. I demand to speak with him alone. The way she said she made it clear I was no longer married to her, just an obstacle between her and her son. Carol maintained her professional composure, but I saw her jaw tighten. Mr. Whitmore is sedated and on a ventilator. No one can speak with him right now. Deborah's eyes narrowed. She pulled out her phone and started making calls, her voice deliberately loud. Richard? It's Deborah. I need you to look into healthcare proxy laws in New York. My son is incapacitated, and there's a situation with his supposed wife. I sat back down in my plastic chair, too exhausted to fight. Let her make her calls. John had been clear about his wishes when we'd drawn up those documents 2 years ago. But watching Deborah pace the hallway like she owned it, demanding meetings with hospital administrators, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just about John's medical care. The next morning, while I was dozing in the chair beside John's bed, Patricia called. Her voice was strangely formal, like she was reading from a script. "Mary, I'm going to stop by the apartment to pick up some of John's things. His insurance cards, some clothes in case he needs them." "I can get those," I said, watching John's chest rise and fall with the ventilator. "I'll be home in a few hours to shower." "No, don't trouble yourself. You should stay with him. Just tell me where you keep important documents." Something in her tone made me sit up straighter. "What documents?" "Oh, insurance papers, bank statements. Mom wants to make sure everything's in order." "Patricia, those are private." "Is the apartment rent controlled?" she asked suddenly. "Mom's curious about the lease situation." The non sequitur threw me. Why would that matter right now? "Just wondering. And the life insurance? John does have life insurance, right? Through his work." I hung up without answering. My hands were shaking as I looked at John, unconscious and vulnerable, tubes running in and out of his body. His family wasn't worried about his recovery. They were already dividing up his life. That evening, John woke briefly. His eyes found mine immediately, and I saw fear there, not of dying but of something else. He couldn't speak around the ventilator, but he squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "It's okay," I whispered, leaning close. "You're going to be fine." He shook his head slightly, tears pooling in his eyes. With effort, he lifted his other hand and pointed toward the door where Deborah had been standing earlier. Then he squeezed my hand again 3 times. Our old code from when we'd attended Deborah's terrible dinner parties. 3 squeezes meant save me. "Your mom?" I asked quietly. He nodded, then mouthed something I couldn't understand. The nurse came in to adjust his medication, and I saw him trying to communicate with her too, growing agitated. "Mr. Whitmore, you need to stay calm," she said gently, increasing his sedative. As the medication took effect, John pulled me closer with what little strength he had. The ventilator made it impossible for him to speak normally, but he managed to whisper around it, his voice barely audible. "Don't let her win." "Win what?" I asked, but his eyes were already closing. His hand moved again, a weak gesture toward his stomach, then lower. He mouthed 2 words, "Freezer." "Remember." "The freezer." I thought he was confused, maybe remembering some old conversation about needing to defrost it. "John, rest now. Don't worry about the apartment." But he shook his head urgently, trying to say more. "Freezer, Mare. Remember the freezer." The medication pulled him under before he could explain. Those would be the last coherent words my husband ever said to me. Deborah returned at 8 that evening, this time with a man in a suit who she introduced as a family advisor. They spoke in hushed tones by the nurse's station, occasionally glancing at me. When visiting hours ended at 9, Deborah made a show of gathering her coat. "Some of us need our rest," she announced to no one in particular. "We can't all sit here indefinitely. I'll be at my hotel if there's any real emergency." She left without saying goodbye to John, without touching him, without even looking at the machines keeping him alive. The night nurse, different from Carol, mentioned an hour later that she'd seen Deborah in the administration office. "She was asking about death certificates," the nurse said quietly. "About who has the authority to claim them, next of kin protocols. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but it seemed strange. Your husband's still fighting." But John wasn't fighting anymore. At 3:47 a.m. his heart gave out. The alarms went off and the room filled with medical staff, but I knew from their faces it was over. I held his hand as they pronounced him, kissed his forehead while it was still warm, and closed his eyes myself because Deborah wasn't there to do it. She'd left me to face his death alone, already planning what came next. The call to the funeral home came at 4:15 a.m., 17 minutes after John's death. They needed to know which location to transport him to. I gave them Grayson and Son's address with a voice that didn't sound like mine, then sat in the hospital corridor until sunrise, unable to move. When I finally left Mount Sinai at 7 that morning, I had one thought: to get home, shower, and find something appropriate to wear for the arrangements I'd have to make. The normalcy of that plan, shower, dress, function, felt like the only thing holding me together. I stopped at the bodega on the corner of 78th and Lexington, the one where Hassan knew our Sunday bagel order by heart. He saw my face and started to ask about John, but something in my expression stopped him. I bought milk, bread, eggs. Absurd purchases for a widow who wouldn't eat for days, but my hands moved on autopilot, selecting items for a life that no longer existed. The plastic bags cut into my wrists as I walked the final block to our building. The elevator ride felt different this time. When it opened on the 4th floor, I fumbled for my keys, juggling grocery bags while searching my purse. The familiar weight of the brass key, worn smooth from 7 years of use, felt reassuring. But when I tried to insert it into the lock of apartment 4B, it stopped halfway. The mechanism had been changed. I pulled the key out, examined it as if it might have transformed somehow, then tried again. Nothing. The brass numbers on our door 4B seemed to mock me. Those numbers I'd traced with my finger countless times, waiting for John to find his keys after date nights, now belonged to a door that wouldn't admit me. Through the peephole I saw movement. Deborah stood in my kitchen wearing the apron John had given me as a joke last Christmas, the one with "Kitchen Goddess" printed across the front. She was holding my grandmother's teacup, the delicate china with tiny violets that had survived 3 generations only to end up in her manicured hands. The sight of her so comfortable in my space, so settled, made my vision blur with rage. I knocked. Softly at first, then harder. The groceries dropped to the floor, milk cartons splitting slightly at the seam. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably 30 seconds, Deborah's footsteps approached. The door opened 3 inches, stopped by the chain I'd installed after a break-in down the hall 2 years ago. "Mary," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You're here sooner than expected. Open the door, Deborah. I live here." She tilted her head, a practiced gesture of concern that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh dear. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. You see, you're just a wife without rights. This apartment belonged to my son. Without children, without your name on the lease, you're simply—" She paused, savoring the words, "a guest whose invitation has expired." The casual cruelty of it, delivered while she wore my apron and held my grandmother's cup, made my knees buckle slightly. I steadied myself against the doorframe, aware that Mrs. Chin had opened her door a crack to observe. "We were married for 7 years, I managed. A piece of paper," Deborah continued, "that ended the moment John died. This is about family now. Real family. Blood family." She emphasized the word blood, like it was sacred, like the years I'd spent loving her son meant nothing against her DNA. Behind her, Patricia emerged from what had been our bedroom. She was carrying an armload of my clothes, folding them with the clinical efficiency of someone packing for charity donation. She didn't look at me, just continued her methodical work, placing my belongings into boxes she'd labeled in her neat handwriting, "Mary's items." "Patricia," I called out. "What are you doing?" She glanced up briefly, her face carefully neutral. "Mom says it's better this way. Clean break. Less painful for everyone." Through the gap in the door I could see more boxes stacked in the living room. My photography books were piled on the coffee table. The throw pillows I'd sewn myself were already in garbage bags. 7 years of building a home, reduced to an estate sale while my husband's body was still warm. "This is illegal," I said, my voice stronger now. "You can't just change the locks. I have rights." "Do you?" Deborah interrupted. "Check the lease, dear. Check whose name is on it. John never added you." I made sure to verify that with building management this morning. They were very helpful once I explained the situation. She was right about the lease. John had always meant to add me, but somehow it had never happened. There was always something more pressing, some reason to delay. Or maybe, I thought now, Deborah had influenced that too, planting seeds of doubt in her son's mind about keeping things separate just in case. "Buy things," I said weakly. "Buy furniture, my—" "Can you prove what's yours?" Patricia asked from behind her mother. "Do you have receipts? Documentation?" Mom's been very careful about cataloging John's possessions. They planned this. Every detail, every word, choreographed while I'd been holding John's hand in the hospital. While I'd been closing his eyes, they'd been changing locks. While I'd been calling the funeral home, they'd been boxing up my life. Where am I supposed to go? The question escaped before I could stop it, revealing my vulnerability. Deborah's smile was small but triumphant. "I'm sure you have family. Friends. Someone who'll take you in. We'll leave your things in the hallway. Take what you can carry now. The building management will dispose of the rest if it's not claimed by tomorrow. She started to close the door, but I wedged my foot in the gap. John would hate this, I said. He would be disgusted by what you're doing. For just a moment, something flickered across Deborah's face. But it was gone instantly, replaced by cold determination. John isn't here to have opinions anymore. And that, dear, is why you need to leave. The door pressed against my foot harder now. Patricia had joined her mother, both of them pushing. I could have fought, could have screamed, could have called the police right then. But as I stood there, groceries leaking milk onto the hallway carpet, something else occurred to me. A memory from 3 years ago, a document they didn't know existed, a secret I'd kept even from John. I stepped back, letting the door close. But not before I smiled, a small knowing smile that made Deborah pause. Enjoy the apartment, I said through the door. Make yourself comfortable. Unpack everything. We intend to, Deborah replied, but I heard uncertainty creep into her voice. I picked up what I could carry, my suitcase, my laptop bag, one box, and left the rest. Mrs. Chin was still watching from her doorway. As I passed, she whispered, I saw them arrive this morning with a locksmith. I tried to tell them to wait, but... It's okay, I told her, and strangely I meant it. Because Deborah Whitmore, in all her meticulous planning, had overlooked one crucial detail. The apartment wasn't just in John's name on the lease. The lease itself was meaningless. 3 years ago, when the building went co-op, I'd bought the apartment through an LLC, keeping John's name on the lease as a formality, a kindness to preserve his pride during a difficult time. As I walked toward the elevator with my pathetic collection of belongings, I wasn't retreating. I was regrouping. Deborah thought she'd won the war with one swift strike, but she'd merely fired the first shot. And tomorrow, when I returned with my lawyer and the ownership documents she never knew existed, she would learn what John had always known. I was stronger than I looked. The hotel elevator smelled like stale beer and disappointment. I rode it down to the lobby, my suitcase wheels catching on the warped threshold as I exited onto 8th Avenue. The Penn Station area at night was a different creature than during the day, neon signs reflecting off wet pavement, even though it hadn't rained. I needed somewhere to think, somewhere Deborah would never look for me. The Comfort Inn's flickering sign promised nothing comfortable, but it took cash and didn't ask questions. Room 317 was exactly what $90 bought near Penn Station. Cigarette burns on the nightstand despite the no-smoking signs, a window that faced a brick wall, and sheets that smelled aggressively of bleach. I dropped my belongings on the floor and sat on the bed's edge, finally allowing myself to process what had just happened. John was dead. I was homeless. His mother had orchestrated a takeover so swift it felt rehearsed. My phone had been silent since I'd left the apartment. Now it lit up with a text from Angela asking about John, another from my coworker wondering if I needed coverage for tomorrow's deadline. The normal world continuing while mine had collapsed. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Sandra Reeves. Sandra and I had been roommates at NYU, back when we thought we'd conquer Manhattan with our respective dreams. Hers in law, mine in writing. We kept in touch sporadically, holiday cards and occasional coffee, but when I'd needed a real estate attorney 3 years ago, she was the only one I trusted. She answered on the first ring despite it being past 9. Mary? I've been thinking about you. How's John? He died this morning. The words came out flat, factual. Her sharp intake of breath carried through the phone. Oh, Mary. I'm so sorry. Sandra, his mother locked me out of the apartment. Changed the locks while I was at the funeral home. She says I have no rights because only John's name is on the lease. Pause. Then Sandra's voice changed, sharpening into her lawyer tone. She did what? Mary, the apartment, you own that apartment. The LLC. She doesn't know about the LLC. Whitmore Mary Holdings, Sandra said slowly, like she was pulling up mental files. We filed that 3 years ago when the building went co-op. You bought it outright, paid cash with your savings and that loan from your brother. Everything's in the corporate name, but you're the sole member. John never knew, I admitted, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a question mark. I kept his name on the lease as a formality, let him think we were still renting. He was so broken after losing his job, Sandra. If he'd known I was paying the mortgage, that I'd bought our home while he couldn't contribute. You protected his pride, Sandra said gently. And now that decision is going to protect you. Deborah has no claim whatsoever. She's trespassing. Can you pull the documents? I need everything tomorrow. I'll have it ready by 8 a.m. Mary, we're going to fix this. She made a serious legal error and we're going to make sure she understands that. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of the shabby room, remembering that night 3 years ago when I'd made the decision that would now save me. John's advertising firm had eliminated his entire department in a corporate restructuring. He'd come home with a banker's box of personal items and eyes that looked hollowed out. 4 weeks he'd sat at our kitchen table, sending out resumes that disappeared into the void, his confidence eroding with each silent rejection. The building's conversion to co-op had seemed like another disaster. Residents could either buy their units or move out within 6 months. The purchase price was reasonable for Manhattan, but still beyond what we could manage with John unemployed. He'd started looking at rentals in Queens, defeated. That's when I'd made my choice. I'd been freelancing as a technical writer for years, quietly building a client base that paid well. My savings account held enough for a down payment, and my brother Thomas had immediately offered to help when I'd called him. "How much do you need?" he'd asked, no hesitation. 50,000, I'd whispered, ashamed to need it. "Done. I'll wire it tomorrow." "And Mary? Don't tell John if it'll hurt him." Men and their pride. Sometimes kindness looks like keeping secrets. The bank had processed everything through Whitmore Mary Holdings LLC, a corporate entity so boring that no one would think to investigate it. I'd signed papers in a conference room that smelled like coffee and toner, my hands steady even as I created this elaborate deception. Every month, I paid the mortgage through the LLC's account, while John continued to write what he thought were rent checks to a management company that no longer existed. I'd deposited them, then transferred the money back to our joint account, an elaborate circle that preserved his dignity. My phone rang, breaking through the memory. Thomas's name lit up the screen. "I just got your message," my brother said, his Boston accent thicker when he was upset. "Mary, what the hell? She locked you out the day John died." "The same day," I confirmed, lying back on the questionable bedspread. His voice cracked with anger. "I'm getting in the car right now. I can be there in 4 hours." "No, Thomas. Not tonight. I need you at the funeral tomorrow." "That woman," he said, and I could hear him pacing, probably in his kitchen where his kids were doing homework. "After everything you've done, after you saved that apartment when John couldn't, does she have any idea what you sacrificed? She's about to find out." "Good. And Mary? That 50,000 I loaned you? Consider it forgiven. Use whatever lawyers you need. Take that apartment back and throw her out on the street." After we hung up, I found myself in the hotel's harsh bathroom, fluorescent lights revealing every hour of the past 3 days in my reflection. My face looked like a stranger's, hollow cheeks, eyes red-rimmed from crying and exhaustion. I still wore my wedding ring, the simple band now covered in a film of hospital disinfectant that wouldn't wash off no matter how hard I scrubbed. I leaned against the cracked sink, water running cold over my hands, and made a decision. This wasn't just about the apartment anymore. Deborah had tried to erase me while I was still raw from watching John die. She'd violated the space where we'd built our life, touched things that held our memories, packed away 7 years like they meant nothing. "John," I whispered to my reflection, his name feeling like both a goodbye and a battle cry. "I'm going to fight for our home." The person staring back at me looked different suddenly. Not stronger exactly, but determined. Tomorrow, I would return to apartment 4B with documents Deborah never knew existed. Tomorrow she would learn that the woman she'd dismissed as just a wife had been protecting that home all along. I turned off the water, dried my hands on the rough paper towels, and walked back into the dim hotel room. Outside, sirens wailed through the night, the city continuing its relentless pace. But in room 317 I sat at the small desk, opened my laptop, and began preparing for war. My laptop's screen glowed in the dark hotel room as I typed out a timeline of events, documenting everything while it was fresh. At 3 a.m. I finally closed the computer and tried to sleep on sheets that felt like cardboard. 4 hours later my phone alarm jolted me awake. Sandra had texted, "Documents ready. Meet me at 8:30, Starbucks on 77th and Lex." The morning air was sharp against my face as I walked from Penn Station. Sandra sat in the corner of the coffee shop, a leather folder thick with papers beside her coffee. She stood when she saw me, pulling me into a brief hug that smelled of expensive perfume and legal authority. "You look terrible," she said matter of fact. "My husband died yesterday. And his mother committed breaking and entering." Sandra opened the folder, spreading documents across the small table. "Here's the deed, the LLC filing, 3 years of mortgage payments from the corporate account, property tax records, everything. She has no legal ground whatsoever." "I need police," I said, scanning the papers. "Already called the precinct. Officer Rodriguez will meet us at the building at 9:30. He specifically handles illegal evictions." Sandra's eyes were sharp behind her glasses. "Mary, when we get there, let me do the talking initially. You're grieving, exhausted and angry. All justified, but we need this clean and legal." At 9:25, we stood outside my building. Officer Rodriguez was already there, a solid man with kind eyes who listened carefully as Sandra explained the situation. Behind him stood a locksmith Sandra had arranged, toolbox in hand. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said to me, "you're saying you own this apartment and someone changed the locks without your permission?" "My mother-in-law. While I was at the funeral home arranging my husband's burial." His jaw tightened slightly. "Let's go have a conversation." The elevator ride felt like ascending to battle. Mrs. Chen's door was cracked open as we passed, her eyes widening at the police presence. Other neighbors peered out, the hallway suddenly alive with witnesses. Rodriguez knocked on 4B with authority that made the sound echo. Deborah answered after the third knock, and her face transformed in stages. Annoyance to confusion to something approaching fear as she registered the uniform. She still wore my apron, kitchen goddess, printed across her chest in faded letters, a detail so absurd it might have been funny under different circumstances. "Officers," she began, recovering quickly, "this woman is harassing me in my late son's home." "Ma'am," Rodriguez interrupted, examining the documents Sandra handed him. "According to these papers, this property belongs to Mary Whitmore through Whitmore Mary Holdings LC. Are you Mary Whitmore?" "I'm Deborah Whitmore. John Whitmore's mother. His real family." "But not Mary Whitmore?" "She's just—" Deborah stopped, looking at the papers in Rodriguez's hands. "What LC? That's impossible." Sandra stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore Sr., I'm Sandra Reeves, representing Mary Whitmore, the legal owner of this property. You've illegally changed the locks and are currently trespassing. We need you to vacate immediately." I moved past them all into my apartment, my home, speaking for the first time. 3 years ago, when the building went co-op, I purchased this unit. Each word came out measured, deliberate. Every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every maintenance fee, all paid by me through my LLC. Deborah's face cycled through emotions like a slot machine spinning. Disbelief, rage, calculation, denial. "John would have told me if you—" John didn't know. The admission felt like removing armor. He'd lost his job. His confidence was shattered. If he'd known I bought our home while he couldn't contribute, it would have destroyed him. So I protected him. Protected us. Patricia emerged from the bedroom, arms full of my sweaters. She froze in the doorway, looking between her mother and Officer Rodriguez like a child caught stealing. The sweaters tumbled from her arms, landing in a heap of cashmere and wool. "Pat," Deborah hissed, "get John's financial documents. Show them the lease." "The lease is meaningless," Sandra interrupted. "A courtesy arrangement between spouses. The deed supersedes any lease agreement." Patricia knelt to gather the sweaters, her hands shaking. "Mom, maybe we should." "We're not going anywhere," Deborah's voice rose. "This is my son's home." She manipulated him, isolated him from his family. "Where were you?" The words erupted from me, weeks of suppressed rage finally breaking free. "When John had chemotherapy every Tuesday for 3 months, where were you? When he couldn't keep food down, when he cried from the pain, when he needed his mother. Where were you, Deborah?" The apartment fell silent. Even the locksmith stopped sorting his tools. "You sent flowers," I continued, my voice steady now. "Expensive arrangements with cards saying, 'Thinking of you.' But you never came. Not once. Patricia, you visited twice in 6 months. Brief visits where you spent more time on your phone than talking to your brother." "We have lives," Patricia started. "He was dying." The words hung in the air. "Your brother, your son, was dying and you couldn't be bothered to show up. But the morning after he died, you managed to hire a locksmith, pack boxes and stage a takeover of his home. Rodriguez cleared his throat. Ma'am, he said to Deborah, you need to remove any belongings you brought and leave the premises. If items have been packed that belong to Mrs. Whitmore, they need to be unpacked. This is ridiculous, Deborah said, but her voice had lost its authority. I'm calling my lawyer. Please do, Sandra said. They can explain trespassing laws and the penalties for illegal eviction attempts. The locksmith began working on the door while Deborah stood frozen in my living room, her entire plan unraveling thread by thread. Patricia quietly began unpacking boxes, returning my books to shelves, my photos to tables. Her movements were mechanical, ashamed. Officer, Deborah tried one more time, surely you can understand a mother's grief. Ma'am, Rodriguez said firmly, grief doesn't justify breaking and entering. I walked to the kitchen where Deborah had been so comfortable hours before. Her china, the blue willow pattern she'd always insisted was superior to everything else, sat stacked on my counter. I picked up a cup, examined it, then set it back down. Take your dishes, I said quietly. Take them and leave. Deborah moved finally, gathering her china with shaking hands. Patricia helped, both of them silent now. The neighbors had emerged fully from their apartments, no longer hiding their interest. Mrs. Chin stood in her doorway, arms crossed, a small satisfied smile on her face. As Deborah passed me carrying her precious china like a refugee, she stopped. You think you've won? I think I've kept my home, I replied. The home John and I built together. The one you tried to steal while his body waits to be buried tomorrow. She flinched at that, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her. Patricia touched her mother's arm, guiding her toward the door where Rodriguez waited. The funeral, Patricia started. Is tomorrow at noon, I said. Your seats are reserved. Front row as his mother and sister. That's the difference between us. I can honor John's love for you while protecting myself from your cruelty. They left without another word, Deborah's heels clicking down the hallway, Patricia trailing behind with one last apologetic glance. Rodriguez stayed until the locksmith finished installing new locks, then handed me 3 sets of keys. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Whitmore, he said gently. Both of them. I stood alone in my reclaimed apartment after Officer Rodriguez left, the new keys heavy in my hand. The silence felt different now, not peaceful but expectant, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sandra had offered to stay, but I needed to be alone with whatever remained of John in these rooms. The late afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced where Deborah had stood hours earlier in my apron. I walked to John's desk, a vintage oak piece we'd rescued from a Brooklyn estate sale 4 years ago. He'd called it his command center, though it usually looked more like organized chaos. Sticky notes layered on top of bills, coffee rings overlapping like Olympic symbols on the wood despite my constant reminders about coasters. Now I had to sort through it all for insurance claims, funeral expenses, the crushing bureaucracy of death. The first drawer stuck as it always did, requiring that specific pull and lift motion John had mastered. Inside lay the mundane debris of a life. Expired coupons, business cards from people he'd never call again, a warranty for a printer we'd thrown out last year. I moved methodically, creating piles. Keep, toss, file. Trying not to think about how I was dismantling the last evidence of his daily existence. In the second drawer, beneath a stack of medical bills I hadn't known existed, my fingers found folded notebook paper. John's handwriting, shakier than usual but unmistakably his, spelled out 5 words that made my breath catch. Mayor, check the freezer. Important. The paper trembled in my hands. This wasn't old. The ink was fresh, maybe a week or 2 at most. He'd written this recently, when his hands had barely been steady enough to hold a pen. The cryptic nature of it, so unlike John's usual directness, suggested he'd hidden something he didn't want found by the wrong person. I walked to our kitchen, the afternoon light now fading into amber. Our freezer, an ancient thing that came with the apartment, hummed its familiar off-key tune. Inside, frozen dinners I'd bought but never made lined the door. Behind them, vegetables we'd optimistically purchased for healthy eating plans that never materialized. I pushed aside a bag of frozen corn, then another of peas, my fingers growing numb from the cold. At the very back, wrapped in a freezer bag and tucked behind ice cream from last summer, was a white business envelope. Ice crystals had formed on its surface, but through the plastic I could see John's handwriting again. For Mary. Only Mary. I sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where we'd shared 7 years of morning coffee, and carefully opened the freezer bag. Inside, the envelope contained 2 items. A brass key with a number etched on it, 317, and a post-it note in John's steadier handwriting from what must have been weeks ago. Mare, I'm sorry for keeping secrets. Mom's been asking strange questions. Patricia too. Created a backup plan. First National Bank on 82nd. Box 317. Everything you need is there. We've both been protecting each other, haven't we? All my love, Jay. My throat tightened. Even while facing death, John had been thinking ahead, preparing for his mother's inevitable move. But his words, "We've both been protecting each other," suggested he knew more than he'd let on. Had he discovered the LLC? Had he known all along that I owned the apartment? First National Bank stayed open until 6 on Fridays. I grabbed my coat and the key, practically running the 5 blocks. The security guard recognized me from the times I'd come with John and nodded sympathetically. The woman at the safe deposit desk, Martha according to her nameplate, pulled up the records with practiced efficiency. "You're listed as the sole beneficiary with full access," she said gently. Mr. Whitmore was very specific about that when he set this up 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. When he'd still been going to chemotherapy, still pretending the treatments might work, still making plans for Italy in October. She led me to a small private room and brought box 317, leaving me alone with whatever John had thought important enough to hide in a freezer. Inside the metal box lay a USB drive, a manila envelope marked legal documents, and a handwritten letter. I opened the letter first, needing to hear John's voice, even if only through ink. "My dearest Mary," it began, "if you're reading this, then Mom has already made her move and you've found my breadcrumbs. I should have been braver, should have confronted her while I was alive, but I was weak. Not from the cancer, but from a lifetime of choosing peace over truth. I had to stop reading, my vision blurring. After a moment I continued. The USB contains something you need to see. I recorded it last week with Marcus Bennett. You remember him from the holiday party? He's a lawyer now. Everything is notarized, witnessed, legal. Mom can't contest it, though she'll try. The apartment is yours, Mary. I know about the I've known for 2 years. My heart stopped. He'd known. I found out by accident. A tax document that came while you were traveling for work. At first I was hurt. Then I was amazed. You saved us, saved our home, and never said a word. You let me keep my dignity while you carried the weight. That's love, Mare. That's the kind of love Mom never understood." I plugged the USB into my phone, sitting alone in that small bank room. John's face appeared on the screen, thin and pale but his eyes still bright with determination. Beside him sat a younger man in a suit, Marcus Bennett, with documents spread on what looked like a conference table. "This is the last will and testament of John Robert Whitmore," Marcus began formally, but John interrupted. "Can we skip to the important part? The personal message." The video jumped to a new clip. John looked directly at the camera, at me. "Mary, everything I have is yours. Every account, every possession, every memory we built together. Marcus has the paperwork, all legal and binding. But there's something else I need to say, and I need Mom to hear it if she challenges this." He paused, gathering strength. "Mom, I know you're watching this because you've tried to take something from Mary. So, he saved me when you wouldn't. When I lost my job, she kept us afloat without ever making me feel small. When I got sick, she held me through every treatment while you sent flowers from a distance. She bought this apartment when I couldn't provide, and she never once held it over me. That's what love looks like, sacrifice without scorekeeping." His voice grew stronger, more certain. "You spent my whole life trying to control me with guilt and obligation. But Mary loved me with freedom and respect. If you're watching this, it means you've already hurt her, already tried to erase her from my life. But you can't. She's not just my wife. She's my choice. And every document in this box proves that choice is legal, binding, and final. Choose love over control, Mom. Just once, choose love." The video ended with John looking exhausted but resolved. Marcus Bennett's voice confirming the date and time, the legal authentication of a dying man's wishes. I sat in that quiet room holding my phone like it was John's hand, feeling the weight of his protection even after death. I left the bank with the USB drive and documents tucked safely in my purse, walking slowly through the evening crowds on Lexington Avenue. The weight of John's video message pressed against my chest. The knowledge that he had known about the LC, had protected me even while I protected him, created a grief so complex I couldn't name it. When I finally reached apartment 4B, my phone was buzzing insistently on the kitchen counter where I'd left it. 3 missed calls from an unknown number. I listened to the voicemail while standing in the exact spot where John had collapsed just days ago, though it felt like a lifetime. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Mitchell Crawford from Crawford, Davies and Associates. I represent Deborah Whitmore regarding the estate of John Whitmore. I believe there's been a misunderstanding that we can resolve amicably. Please call me at your earliest convenience. The formality of his tone, the careful way he said misunderstanding instead of illegal eviction attempt, told me everything about Deborah's next strategy. I called back immediately, not wanting to give her time to maneuver. Mr. Crawford, I said when his secretary connected us. I understand you represent my mother-in-law. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. I believe we can reach a settlement that works for everyone. Mrs. Whitmore Sr. is prepared to offer you a generous sum to relocate, allowing the family home to remain with blood relatives. The phrase, blood relatives again, as if love could be measured in DNA. How generous? I asked, curious about their desperation. $50,000. Gosh. You could start fresh, find a new place without the painful memories. I actually laughed, a sound that surprised us both. Mr. Crawford, are you aware that I own this apartment outright? That your client committed breaking and entering? Pause. Mrs. Whitmore Sr. contests the validity of that ownership. Then she can contest it in court, where I'll play a video of John explicitly stating I saved him financially while she abandoned him during cancer treatment. Would she prefer that to be public record? The silence stretched longer this time. Perhaps we could discuss this further. The funeral is in 3 days, I interrupted. Tell Deborah she can attend as his mother, sit in the front row as I promised, and grieve her son with dignity. Or she can pursue this legally and have John's final message to her become public testimony. Her choice. I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From rage, clean and clarifying. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. Through the peephole, I saw Mrs. Chin holding a tea tray, her small frame draped in the burgundy cardigan she wore for serious occasions. I opened the door and she shuffled in without waiting for an invitation. You need to know something, she said, setting the tray on my coffee table with practiced efficiency. About that woman. Deborah. I sat across from her, accepting the cup she poured. The jasmine scent filled the room, replacing the lingering smell of Deborah's perfume. She's been coming here for a year, Mrs. Chin said, her voice low as if Deborah might still be listening. Once a month, sometimes more. Always when you and John were at work. A year. My stomach turned cold. She had a key, yes, but she did more than water plants. I saw her with measuring tape taking photos of every room. 2 months ago she brought a man in a hard hat, contractor I think. They discussed renovation costs, wall removal, modernizing the kitchen. The premeditation of it stole my breath. While John was getting his diagnosis, his mother was planning to renovate our home. While I was researching treatment options, she was measuring for new countertops. She asked me once if you had family nearby, Mrs. Chin continued. If you'd have somewhere to go when the time came. I thought she meant if you divorced. Now I understand she meant when John died. She knew he was terminal before we did, I whispered, the realization sickening. Mothers always know, Mrs. Chin said sadly. But knowing and accepting are different things. She chose to plan for his absence instead of treasuring his presence. After Mrs. Chin left, I sat at John's desk with funeral programs spread before me. Grayson and Sons had sent templates, suggested readings, traditional hymns. I pushed them all aside. John deserved truth, not convention. I selected readings from Kurt Vonnegut, John's favorite author, passages about love and loss that Deborah would find insufficiently religious. The music would include Here Comes the Sun, the song he'd hummed every Sunday morning, off-key and perfect. Instead of asking Deborah's pastor to speak, I invited John's colleague Marcus, who'd witnessed our actual marriage, not the version Deborah had constructed in her mind. I was addressing envelopes for the programs when my phone rang. Patricia's name appeared, surprising me. Please don't hang up, she said immediately, her voice small and uncertain. What do you want, Patricia? To apologize. Mom doesn't know I'm calling. She's meeting with her lawyer trying to find ways around your ownership. And you're calling because? A shaky breath. Because I helped her try to steal your home and I'm disgusted with myself. Mom promised me John's savings if I helped. I'm getting divorced, Mary. I need money for lawyers for starting over. She said you'd be fine, that you had family money, that you'd never really loved John anyway. I loved him more than you'll ever understand. I know that now. The way you fought for your home, the way John protected you even after death. That's love. Mom never understood it because Dad never stood up to her, never chose her over anything. She can't recognize what she never had. The bitterness in Patricia's voice revealed years of damage I'd never seen. Can I still come to the funeral? She asked. I understand if you say no. I thought about John, about what he would want. Despite everything, he'd loved his sister, worried about her marriage, sent her money when she'd asked. You can come, I said finally. But you sit where I place you and you don't speak unless I ask you to. Thank you, she whispered. Mary? The contractor Mom brought, she already paid him a deposit. $5,000. She was that certain John would die and you'd disappear. After Patricia hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of our apartment, surrounded by funeral plans and legal documents. Tomorrow would begin 3 days of public grief, of managing Deborah's presence while honoring John's memory. But tonight I had one more task. I opened John's laptop and began writing his eulogy. Not the sanitized version Deborah would prefer, but the truth about a man who loved Beatles music and bad coffee, who lost a job and found resilience, who knew his wife had saved them and loved her more for allowing him his pride. I finished typing the last line of John's eulogy at 2 a.m., my laptop screen the only light in our dark apartment. The words blurred through exhausted eyes, but they were honest words, true words that John deserved to have spoken at his service. I closed the computer and tried to sleep on the couch, unable to face our empty bed, but rest wouldn't come. Tomorrow, today now, I would bury my husband while managing his mother's presence, a balancing act between grief and vigilance. The morning arrived gray and humid, the kind of October day that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. I dressed carefully in the black dress John had loved, the one he'd bought me for our 5th anniversary dinner. My hands shook as I fastened the pearl necklace he'd given me last Christmas, my last Christmas gift from him. The reflection in the mirror showed a widow, a word that still felt foreign and wrong. I arrived at the chapel an hour early, needing to ensure everything was arranged before Deborah appeared. The funeral director, Mr. Grayson, met me at the entrance with practiced sympathy and a clipboard of final details. John's casket sat at the front, closed as I'd requested, surrounded by the arrangements his co-workers and friends had sent. Simple white roses and lilies, nothing like the ostentatious displays Deborah would have chosen. The programs are on each seat as you requested, Grayson said quietly. The musician knows the playlist. Is there anything else you need? Before I could answer, movement at the chapel entrance caught my attention. Deborah had arrived 45 minutes early, but she wasn't alone. Flanking her were 3 people I barely recognized: John's cousin Robert from Philadelphia, cousin Dennis from Baltimore, and an older man who must have been Uncle William, Deborah's brother, whom John had mentioned maybe twice in 7 years. They walked in formation like an honor guard, their dark suits and grim faces suggesting they'd been briefed for battle rather than mourning. Deborah wore a black suit with a veil, the picture of maternal grief, though the veil conveniently obscured her expression. She paused just inside the entrance, surveying the chapel like a general reviewing troops, clearly expecting to find empty seats she could fill with her reinforcements. Instead, she found John's co-workers already assembled, having arrived even earlier at my request. Marcus from accounting, Lisa from creative, Paul from IT. People who'd known John daily, who'd witnessed our marriage in real time, who'd heard him talk about his mother's criticisms and his wife's support. They looked up as Deborah entered, their faces neutral but alert. I walked directly to Deborah before she could advance further into the chapel. Deborah, I said loud enough for everyone to hear. How thoughtful of you to bring family members who haven't seen John in years. Robert shifted uncomfortably. Dennis looked at his shoes. Uncle William, whom I'd never met, stepped forward. You must be Mary, he said, extending his hand. Deborah told us about the situation with the apartment. Said you'd locked her out while she was trying to preserve John's memory. The lie was so bold, so completely inverted from reality that I almost admired it. Almost. Actually, I said, maintaining eye contact with William while aware everyone was listening. Deborah changed the locks on my apartment the day John died while I was at the funeral home. She told me I was just a wife without rights and tried to steal my home. The police had to remove her. William's hand dropped. He turned to look at his sister, whose face behind the veil had gone rigid. The police? Robert asked, his voice cracking slightly. For breaking and entering, I confirmed. I own the apartment. Have for 3 years. Deborah knew John was dying and tried to take advantage of my grief to steal it. Dennis actually stepped away from Deborah, creating physical distance from the revelation. William's face flushed red. Deborah, he said slowly, you told me this woman was a gold digger who'd manipulated John. You said she'd stolen from the family. She has, Deborah started, but William held up his hand. I'm here for John, he said firmly. Not for whatever this is. He looked at me. I apologize. I didn't know my nephew well, but he didn't deserve to have his funeral turned into this. May I still attend? Of course, I said. John would have wanted family here. Real family who came to mourn him, not to wage war. William walked past his sister without another word, choosing a seat on what had clearly become my side of the chapel. After a moment's hesitation, Dennis followed. Robert lingered, torn between loyalty and shame, before Deborah grabbed his arm. We'll sit in the front, she declared, though her voice had lost its commanding tone. Your seats are reserved, I said. Front row as promised. You and Patricia. The service began at noon precisely. Reverend Mills, whom I'd chosen specifically because he didn't know Deborah, spoke about loss and love with genuine warmth. When it came time for the eulogy, I stood at the podium with John's own words in my hands. I want to share something John wrote. I began, my voice steadier than expected. Not long ago, when he knew his time was limited. I unfolded the paper, the one I'd found with the video will instructions, and read. If you're hearing this, it means my mother is probably sitting in the front row planning how to rewrite our story. So let me be clear. I chose Mary over my mother's approval every single day for 7 years. It was the easiest choice I ever made. Mom never understood that love isn't about control or conditions. It's about choosing someone's happiness over your own comfort. Mary did that for me every day, especially when I couldn't provide for us. She saved us financially and never made me feel small for it. Mom, if you're listening, know this. Every time you criticized Mary, you pushed me further away. Every time you made her feel unwelcome, you made me feel homeless in my own family. I found my real home with Mary. That's my truth. That's my legacy. The chapel fell silent. Deborah sat frozen, her veil hiding whatever emotion might have crossed her face. Patricia, who'd arrived late and slipped into the back, had tears streaming down her cheeks. The co-workers who'd heard years of John's frustrations about his mother nodded knowingly. When the service ended, people filed past to offer condolences. Deborah remained seated, isolated in the front row as mourners deliberately avoided her, approaching me instead. Even Robert eventually came over, mumbling an apology before fleeing the chapel. Finally, Patricia approached. She held an envelope in her trembling hands. This is the spare key Mom used, she said quietly, placing it in my palm. The one she had made last year when she started planning. She glanced at her mother, still sitting alone. You were the only one who really loved him. Mom loved the idea of him, the son she wanted him to be. But you loved John as he was. Patricia walked away then, not to her mother but to the exit, leaving Deborah completely alone in the front row of her son's funeral. The woman who'd arrived with reinforcements now sat abandoned, even by the family she'd recruited. The chapel emptied around her, voices fading, footsteps receding, until it was just her and the absence of the son she'd tried to control even after death. I stood at the back of the chapel, watching her sit with the consequences of her choices. There would be more battles, I knew. The will, the estate, the endless legal maneuvers she would likely attempt. But in this moment at John's funeral, the truth had been spoken and heard. I remained at the chapel entrance, watching Deborah finally rise from the front pew. She moved slowly, as if the weight of John's words had aged her in the span of an hour. When she passed me, she said nothing, her veil still hiding her face. The click of her heels on marble faded as she disappeared into the gray afternoon. I stood alone in the empty chapel for another moment, then walked to my car with the spare key Patricia had returned still clutched in my palm. That evening, I sat at John's computer with the USB drive containing his video will. The apartment felt different now, quieter but somehow more mine. I opened John's email contacts and began typing addresses. Robert in Philadelphia, Dennis in Baltimore, Uncle William, and a dozen other relatives Deborah had kept in her orbit through carefully crafted stories about our marriage. Each would receive the same message with the same attachment. Dear family, I wrote, John left a video message he wanted you to see. He asked that truth be shared with those who matter. Please watch when you're ready. With love, Mary. I attached the video file and hit send before I could reconsider. Within minutes, my phone began buzzing with read receipts. Then 20 minutes later, the first response came from Uncle William. Mary, I just watched John's video. I am deeply ashamed of my sister's behavior and my own assumptions. John was lucky to have you. If you need anything, please reach out. Dennis wrote next, a longer email describing how Deborah had called him monthly with updates about John's deteriorating situation and my supposed manipulation. Robert's response was shortest but perhaps most telling. Now I understand why John stopped coming to family gatherings. It wasn't you keeping him away. By midnight, 7 family members had responded, each revealing pieces of Deborah's campaign against me that had been running for years. She had painted me as a gold digger at first, then as controlling, finally as negligent when John got sick. The video of John, clear-eyed and determined, describing how I had saved them financially while preserving his dignity, shattered every narrative she had built. The next morning, a Saturday, I was drinking coffee when someone knocked forcefully on my door. Through the peephole, I saw Mitchell Crawford, Deborah's attorney, holding a thick manila envelope. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, clearly uncomfortable. I'm here to serve you with legal documents. I took the envelope, scanning the papers while he waited. Deborah was suing me for emotional distress, defamation, and something called intentional infliction of emotional suffering through public humiliation. She was seeking damages of $200,000. This is desperation, I said, looking up at Crawford. He shifted his weight. Mrs. Whitmore Sr. feels the video distribution constitutes. The truth constitutes defamation now? I'm just the messenger, he said, already backing away. The court date is set for Tuesday. Tuesday came quickly. The courthouse on Center Street was busier than during our previous visit. Deborah sat with Crawford at the plaintiff's table, her posture rigid, wearing the same black suit from the funeral. Sandra sat beside me, having reviewed the frivolous lawsuit with barely concealed amusement. Judge Harrison, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, reviewed the documents with obvious impatience. She looked up at Crawford. Counselor, your client is claiming emotional distress because the deceased's video was shared with family members? The video contained defamatory statements. Made by the deceased himself? The judge's eyebrows rose. Are you suggesting Mrs. Whitmore somehow forced her dying husband to record false statements? Crawford fumbled with his papers. The distribution was malicious. Was it? Judge Harrison turned to Sandra. Ms. Reeves, why was this video distributed? Sandra stood. Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore Sr. had been spreading false information about my client to family members for years. The video was Mr. Whitmore's own words, his truth, shared with his family as he requested. Additionally, I'd like to submit evidence of Mrs. Whitmore Sr.'s attempted illegal eviction of my client on the day of Mr. Whitmore's death. She handed over our documentation, the police report, the ownership papers, Officer Rodriguez's statement. Judge Harrison read in silence for several minutes, her expression growing sterner with each page. Mrs. Whitmore Sr., the judge said finally, looking directly at Deborah. You changed the locks on an apartment you didn't own, while the legal owner was at a funeral home arranging her husband's burial? Deborah started to speak, but Crawford touched her arm, silencing her. Your Honor, Crawford attempted, that matter has been resolved. Has it? The judge's voice was ice. Because from where I sit, I see a pattern of harassment. Mrs. Whitmore Sr., not only am I dismissing this frivolous lawsuit, but I'm issuing a warning. Any further legal action against Mary Whitmore that lacks substantial merit will result in harassment charges. Am I clear? Deborah's "Yes, Your Honor" was barely audible. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued. If you come within 100 feet of Mrs. Whitmore or her property without explicit written permission, you will be arrested. This is not a suggestion. We left the courthouse in silence. Deborah and Crawford hurried to a waiting car while Sandra and I walked slowly, processing what had just happened. Every legal avenue Deborah might have pursued had been closed in less than 20 minutes. That afternoon I met with a locksmith Sandra had recommended, someone who specialized in biometric systems. As he worked on installing the new lock, Mrs. Chin emerged from her apartment with tea and cookies. Good, she said, watching the locksmith program the scanner. No more keys for that woman to copy. The locksmith explained the system. My fingerprint backed up with a code only I would know. No physical keys existed. The click of the lock engaging sounded different now, electronic and final. Mrs. Chin nodded approvingly. Your home is yours alone now, she said. As it should be. 3 days passed in quiet. I began sorting through John's things properly without urgency or fear of invasion. On the 4th morning I found a plain white envelope under my door, no stamp or address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with Deborah's distinctive handwriting. The same hand that had signed birthday cards with conditional love, that had written checks with reluctant support. Just 2 sentences, you won. He chose you. No signature, no return address, but I knew. The admission must have cost her everything. Her pride, her constructed narrative, her sense of maternal ownership. I held the paper for a long moment, considering whether to keep it or throw it away. Finally, I folded it carefully and placed it in John's desk drawer, not as a trophy but as evidence that somewhere, beneath all her control and cruelty, Deborah had finally heard what her son had been trying to tell her. He had chosen love over blood, partnership over possession, and in the end, even she had to acknowledge that truth. I closed the drawer containing Deborah's admission and walked to the window overlooking the fire escape. April sunshine streamed through the glass, warming my face in a way that reminded me spring had arrived without permission, without waiting for grief to subside. The fire escape, which John had always talked about converting into a small garden, remained empty except for the folding chair where he used to drink his morning coffee. 6 months had passed since the funeral. The sharp edges of loss had not dulled exactly, but they had become familiar, like learning to navigate around furniture in the dark. I moved through the apartment differently now, no longer startled by the silence, no longer expecting to hear John's key in the lock at 6:30 p.m. That morning I finally opened the bottom drawer of John's desk where I had tucked his garden journal months ago, unable to face his handwriting, his plans for a future that would never arrive. The notebook, a simple composition book from the drugstore, contained sketches and notes in his methodical style. Pages of research about which herbs grew best in partial shade, which containers provided proper drainage, detailed drawings of how to maximize the fire escape's limited space. On the last page, dated 2 weeks before his collapse, he had written, "For Mary, start with basil and rosemary. They're forgiving. Like you." Below that, a rough sketch of rectangular planters arranged along the railing, each labeled with planting depths and watering schedules. I carried the journal to the hardware store on 2nd Avenue, showing the sketches to an employee who helped me select appropriate containers and soil. The basil seeds came in a packet decorated with optimistic green leaves. The rosemary starter plants smelled like Sunday dinners we would never have again. I bought everything, plus a small watering can John had circled in the journal with a note. The yellow 1M's favorite color. Setting up the garden took most of the afternoon. I arranged the containers exactly as John had sketched, securing them to the railing with wire to prevent wind damage. The soil felt cool and forgiving between my fingers as I planted each seed, each starter, following his instructions with the devotion of someone following a treasure map. When I finished, the fire escape looked purposeful for the first time since we had moved in. 2 weeks later, the first green shoots pushed through the soil. I was photographing them with my phone when someone knocked. Through the peephole, I saw Patricia standing in the hallway with 2 children, a boy around 8 and a girl maybe 6, both with John's distinctive brown eyes. I had not spoken to Patricia since the funeral when she had returned the spare key. Opening the door felt like crossing a bridge I was not sure would hold. "Mary," she said, her voice uncertain. "I know I should have called first. These are my kids, Michael and Emma. They never really knew their Uncle John, and I thought, I wanted them to know you." The children stood partially behind their mother, curious but shy. The boy held a small potted plant. "We brought this for you," Michael said, extending the pot. Mom said Uncle John liked gardens. It was a mint plant, already fragrant and unruly. I accepted it carefully, then stepped aside to let them in. Patricia's relief was visible as she guided her children into the apartment. "Mom doesn't know I'm here," Patricia said quietly while the children explored the living room. "She wouldn't understand. But I've been thinking about John's video about what he said. He was right. We were so concerned with what family should look like that we missed what it actually was." Emma had discovered the fire escape garden through the kitchen window. "Aunt Mary, you have plants outside." I opened the window and helped both children onto the fire escape, showing them John's journal, explaining how each plant had its own needs and personality. Michael immediately began asking questions about growth rates and photosynthesis. Emma wanted to know if the plants had names. "Not yet," I told her. "Would you like to name them?" As the children debated names for basil plants, Patricia stood beside me in the kitchen. "I'm getting divorced," she said quietly. "Finally. And I wanted my kids to know that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who choose to love you even when it's complicated." After they left, promising to return when the herbs were ready to harvest, Mrs. Chin knocked with her evening tea ritual. We sat by the window watching the sunset paint the fire escape golden. "This building has stories," she said unexpectedly. "The woman who lived here before the last tenant back in the 80s. Her name was Ruth. Her husband died young and his family tried to force her out. She fought them for 2 years, kept her home, lived here until she was 93. You knew her. She taught me that a woman's home is her fortress. That roots, once planted deep enough, cannot be pulled up by anyone." Mrs. Chin gestured toward the fire escape garden. "John's plants will grow strong here. And maybe you should think about helping other women who face what you faced. You have knowledge now, experience that could save someone else." That night, I stood in my kitchen making coffee with the same routine I had developed over 7 years, but everything felt different. Not wrong, just evolved. John's mug remained in the cabinet, untouched but present, like a bookmark in a story I was still reading. The walls we had painted together still held our color choices, our arguments about shades, our laughter over roller mishaps. The biometric lock clicked as I tested it one more time before bed, a sound that had become comforting rather than necessary. No one would try to take this apartment again. Deborah had retreated into whatever corner of Long Island she inhabited, her silence more complete than any restraining order could achieve. I understood finally that victory was not about defeating Deborah or even keeping the apartment. It was about continuing to live fully in the space John and I had created together, allowing it to evolve while honoring what it had been. The herbs on the fire escape would grow and eventually bloom. Patricia's children would visit again, bringing noise and questions. Mrs. Chin would continue her tea visits with stories of the building's history. My roots had grown too deep for anyone to tear away, not because I had fought for them but because I had planted them with love, watered them with tears, and given them time to strengthen in soil that knew my name. The apartment was more than property now. It was proof that some things once truly owned can never be taken away. If this story of resilience and justice kept you captivated until the very end, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Mary revealed the LLC ownership to Deborah while the police stood watching, completely dismantling her mother-in-law's carefully planned takeover. What was your most satisfying moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.